A lot of people think creating an online workshop is complicated, but all you really need are three things. First, a concept or framework you're going to cover. Second, you need at least one exercise to apply it. And thirdly, you just need some structure around that exercise to make sure that it's effective and not just a boring Zoom lecture where people are snoozing and passively consuming information. So in today's video, I'm going to walk you through a 5-step process that I've cultivated over the past 3 years working with course creators to help them create their own courses, programs, or even just managers trying to run more interesting training sessions with their teams. So we're going to do 5 things together. And the way I've set up this video is you can do it in one of 2 ways. You can either just zoom through it, get the information, and do what you will with it. Or secondly, you can go through it and you'll see I've set it up so it's it's as if we're doing the workshop live. So you can hit pause when I have an exercise and actually work through it as we go, so that by the end you actually have an outline for a workshop of your own. But either way, the timestamps are in the description, so feel free to hop to and from whichever sections are of most interest. But let's get into it. All right, so building engaging online workshops. So again, I'm gonna go through this in a slide format as if we were all together in a Zoom room. That way, as you go through it and you pick up tips on how to structure your sessions, you'll also get inspiration around how I myself do my workshops, my individual exercise prompts, and a host of other things throughout the session. So first things first, you always want to introduce yourself. So I'm going to take that opportunity to introduce myself. I'm Alexandra Allen, and I'm an online course designer and trainer. I've worked on some course accelerators like Mavens. I've worked with top online courses like Rite of Passage. And before that, I was working at a startup hub called District 3. So I'm really accustomed to creating these online courses, programs, and workshops, and using what I think of as a flipped classroom approach where people come to sessions to actually do work rather than just listen to a lecture and then go off to do their own thing. So really, I think of workshops as a primer to do other things. And my background is in learning design and tech. I'm also a project manager. So again, this is where my love for structure comes from. And I work remotely in Montreal, Canada, but I've also lived in London, Sydney, and Paris, and still work with many clients around the world. So I always give people a checklist for a great session. And I do this because I think it's important to encourage people to put their cameras on. You'll notice a lot of people will kind of sneak into these sessions and kind of, test the waters, get the vibe before turning on their camera. So I always offer an enthusiastic welcome, encourage people to turn their cameras on and to share questions and comments, by raising their hand or popping them in the chat. I always want to reiterate that people should be respectful to everyone, and let people know that ideally I want them to participate in breakouts and complete the exercises as we go through it. Just because the sooner you tell people in the session and set the expectation that it's going to be an active learning session, the more likely people are to involve themselves and contribute. And if you don't say that explicitly, a lot of people will just assume it's another glorified webinar masked as a workshop, and that they're just here to listen. So give people that warm welcome, encourage them to turn on their cameras by saying it explicitly, and hopefully a lot of people will lean into that welcoming energy. I also like to often ask a poll question to get a vibe of who's in the room. Now, this may depend on, if you already know who's coming, you can ask maybe a more pointed question. But in the case of recently I did a workshop for university students, one of the questions I like to ask at the start is, which faculty do you belong to? Because it gives me a bit of an idea of who's in the room, what specialties are coming. So depending on what you're doing, you might want to just throw up a question to get a sense of who's in the room in a way that will help kind of inform how you're going to lead the session. And ideally, if you could find that stuff out beforehand, even better, but it's just part of the fun of seeing who's in the virtual room together. So now to jump back to the agenda I mentioned earlier, we're going to do 5 things. So we're going to start by debunking myths. We're going to create constraints. We're going to identify desired outcomes. Then we're going to identify a path to those outcomes. And finally, we'll wrap up by drafting activity and reflection prompts. So again, you'll notice here with the agenda, all of these terms, they're all action oriented. And again, the reason, again, this is kind of meta because I'm teaching you how to, additional things as I'm going, in addition to how to structure yours. But the idea here is you really want to always have verbs and terms that signal that people are going to be taking action with you, even if you're guiding them, as opposed to just sitting back and being informed, which could ultimately just be a video or webinar. So I always like to, again, with the agenda, highlight I put them in like faded text and kind of highlight what we're going through piece by piece. And you'll notice as I go through this, every time I switch sections, I will revert back to this agenda and highlight which point we're at, because again, this is all part of helping people with creating a mental model of how all the information and activities you're giving them fit together into a cohesive whole. And it can be confusing for people. Granted, you as the trainer or facilitator, it might seem obvious where you are in the session, but for other people, you want them to have a very smooth ease of understanding how everything fits together. That way they're not wasting brain power wondering, oh, so where are we in the session? They're thinking, okay, right now we're in the debunking myths section, and if there's activities or information I need to take in, I can dedicate my brain power to that versus thinking, okay, what's going on? Am I lost? So again, this is just like a roadmap that you kind of circle back to. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into debunking myths about workshops. So there's 3 myths about workshops that I see commonly circulated. The first one is that people say start with the first thing students need to know. But the expert point of view here is that that's actually wrong, because backward design, which is a learning framework to plan curriculums or any sort of lesson planning, dictates that you should always start with the outcome to figure out what do you want to achieve by the end of a workshop, a course, etc., and then figure out where students or participants are, and then work backwards to figure out, okay, what's the simplest route, the minimum viable path for them to get there. Because otherwise what happens is you give students too much information. So you really want to start with the outcome and work backwards. The second point that people get wrong is that people think more content equals more value. And again, this is a big myth with workshops, because again, it's meant to be about creating space for people to actually practice things, get feedback, and iterate. And again, I talked about workshops being this, primer to do something later. So you want to give people an opportunity to get their feet wet and actually get doing stuff. And the way you do that is by keeping the content to a minimum. So all of the content, you want to think of this, and as we go through the structure of how to do your workshops, you'll see what I mean. But it starts with figuring out what are the exercises people need to perform in order to achieve the outcome you're shooting for. And then after that, you'll be able to decide, okay, what is the minimum viable content to tee them up for these exercises. And then thirdly, a lot of people think with a workshop, they think, okay, well, I need to present for most of the session. There needs to be, high production value. That's actually not the case at all. The expert point of view is that if you're following this flipped classroom approach, where if you think of the term workshop, its origin, it comes from, like wood shop, right? Of people doing things in, with tools and stuff and getting their hands messy, dirty. You get what I mean? But the point is, it's about creating space to actually do stuff. So you as the facilitator, teacher, presenter, whatever you want to call yourself, you're just there to guide people and give feedback, but really it's about creating space. So circling, back to that point I made in point 2 about use minimum viable content. You also want to think, okay, I'm going to speak for, 20% of the session. And that's part of the giving content and setting people up for exercises and then recapping on takeaways. But the 80% of the session, the core of it, you really want to be creating space for students to learn through exercises. So in essence, their experience, and by reflecting on what they're doing. So I always like to show this image next of before we go into this idea of actually creating, an outline of your workshop, because that's really what you start with, is an outline that you can then build out with slides and stuff. A lot of people like to jump to slides first, but that's really makes things chaotic. So the best is to keep it simple by doing a first draft of how your workshop flow will look. And I always tell people you're not going to feel like this guy, super enthusiastic and happy, but that's okay. Like the first outline sometimes can be, well, it often is very messy. Until you get the hang of it, you'll get more efficient at it. But getting started out, it'll be messy. It might feel frustrating and timely. It'll take longer to do at first, but once you get the science, the rhythm of it, you'll start pumping these out a lot faster. So the point is, let that pressure go. And leading off that point, I always tell people when I'm running this session is just imagine, that we have this famous Banksy image. Imagine releasing your expectations like a balloon, just letting it go. And I know balloons are bad for the environment, so don't worry, I'm not encouraging you to release any balloons, just metaphorically speaking. But just think, you're in a supportive environment. Everything always takes longer at first, and getting started is usually the hardest part. So don't quit before you give yourself a chance to really try running a workshop and try building one out. And just remember that your first draft doesn't have to be perfect. It's like writing, you'll draft something and then you can edit it, but just getting started, even if you're writing in bullet points to get started, that's fine. You can refine it later. So you just have to, commit to yourself. Am I going to trust this process of, the creative process of you, if you will, of just putting some ideas down and kind of fleshing them out and seeing where I end up. And this is often where I invite people to, unmute and affirm, yes, they will trust the process. So I will leave it to you if you want to do that in the privacy of your own home. But all that to say, just if you're willing to release your expectations, this whole process is going to be a lot easier and a lot more fun. And again, I just mentioned that, creating a workshop or drafting a workshop is like writing. So that goes beyond that to say that the practice of instructional design, some people call it learning design, of creating learning experiences ultimately, is a lot like writing, where you'll spend 10% drafting and then 90% of it is about redesigning. So you get things down and then you work with them like clay and kind of decide what you want to tweak, what you want to move around, because ultimately you're building an experience. So it's all about just kind of getting started and then working from there, everything gets easier. But the problem is a lot of people get stuck on that initial 10% because people want things to be perfect right out of the gate, and then they get overwhelmed and they quit. And that's why so many people are afraid or, avoid running workshops. But it can be a real career booster to run workshops because, again, whether or not you're teaching an individual session, a course, or you're a manager who's trying to, make team trainings or team meetings more engaging, getting accustomed to running, building engaging workshops is really one of the top skills you could have in 2023. So I say think of, in order to make the barrier to entry easier and make that 10%, less intimidating so that you can just get started, I like to quote author Anne Lamott. She calls, a first draft, she says it's like the child's draft. And she has this great example in her book, Bird by Bird, great book if you haven't read it. But she talks about how children, don't take their creative projects, they don't overthink them. And I know many of you listening, whether you have kids or kids, I think we can all agree that a toddler thinking of, something they're going to take on, something they're going to do, some business they're going to conduct, if you will, they don't overthink it. I mean, if they want to flush something down the toilet, if they want to throw something across the room or, put paint on the wall, they're not going to be sitting there, tapping their chin, thinking through, okay, how should I go about this? They're just like heart and soul. They go with their gut. So I want you to kind of embrace your inner toddler then and just kind of go with your first instincts, because often with the first draft, some of those first instincts are really great gems that just need to be kind of, shined up and into like a full-blown experience. But there's some great ideas that will come out if you just let your ideas flow. So just think of it like that, the child's draft. Have fun with it. Just get some ideas down as we're going through the steps. And don't worry, you can always refine them down the road. All right. So that's it for this section. And then we'll hop to the next one. Okay, so to recap this section, I want you to keep 3 things in mind as you build your workshops. The first one, be outcome driven. Start with the outcome and work backwards from there. Second of all, prioritize activities, feedback, and iteration. Don't worry so much about content. You want just enough content to get people going on the exercises. And then thirdly, remember that it's not all about you talking. That would make it a webinar. So in order to make it a workshop, make sure you're following the 80-20 principle and spending 80% of the session getting people to do the activities, to get feedback, and to iterate on what they're doing. So really just make it about them. All right, so in the next section now, we're gonna jump into how do you start by creating constraints so that you're not all over the place when you're running your workshop. So let's jump into that now. Okay, so creating constraints. Now, before we jump into that, I just want to highlight that again, as I mentioned, I'm coming back to the agenda. And as you notice, I've kind of faded out what we've done and what's to come, just so people can follow along of where we are in the sequence of things we're going to do. So creating constraints, very simple. This step is the shortest and the sweetest. So again, in terms of lowering that barrier to entry, I'm making it easy for you to start following along. And this is something you should aim for with participants and students of your own, is making the first step really easy so that people get a quick win and think, okay, I'm following along, I can participate, I don't need to run for the hills, this isn't super intimidating. And then you can, move into more difficult stuff as you go. But so the first thing I get people to do in terms of creating constraints for their workshop is to think about what concept or framework are they going to focus it on and what's the duration. So just to give you an example, of a concept or framework, this is something that's worth knowing about your topic. So if you just kind of want to run a workshop on a general topic that's really broad and people won't necessarily know what you're going to cover and it's hard to get really specific. So what you want to do is think of something under the umbrella of your topic. So for example, maybe a project manager would want to run a workshop on SMART goals, or a copywriter might want to run a workshop on writing cold emails with Ada. Someone like me who's a trainer would run a session on how to outline a workshop, essentially what we're doing now. So the idea is pick a concept or framework and write it down as part of your first constraint. And again, I said earlier, but whatever you're planning to do, I guarantee you probably are attempting to cram too much into too little time, but that's okay. The idea with getting started here is if you realize you have too much, like let's say, for example, the project manager who wants to do a workshop on SMART goals, maybe they decide, okay, actually, each of the letters in the acronym should be its own workshop, and this should be like a 5-part workshop series, or, even 3-part if they can cram some of them together. But the point is, as you go through this exercise, you'll figure out, okay, if you want to go, more deep on the topic, you might need to do more than one workshop. But for today, we're going to talk about how you structure one, because it's a rinse and repeat formula that if you decide you want to break it up into different ones, you'll at least have the process down. So the other thing you want to do after you have your concept and framework is think about the duration. And again, my tip is to aim for 60 to 90 minutes. The reason being that 60 minutes and 90 minutes are usually pretty easy to cram into your calendar. You'd be surprised at how many people are deterred by 2-hour sessions. So just the 30-minute difference of 90 minutes to 2 hours, significant drop off. I myself, when I say a 2-hour block, think, oh God, that's long. So bear that in mind. And also 90 minutes is an ideal time for people to get into a flow state. So it can work quite well. But 60 minutes, if you're kind of doing it for a random group who don't want to dedicate too much time, 60 minutes is a good window for people to get, in and out, get some great value in the meantime. And something that I would caution everyone to bear in mind is, again, in terms of wanting to cram in too much into one session, guarantee you're going to run over however much time you allocate for yourself. So I always tell people, if you've been given a 90-minute slot for a workshop and you're new to this, then aim to do a workshop of 60 minutes. So you're telling people it's 90 minutes and they're budgeting that for their time. But in terms of organizing it, you're planning it as if it was 60 so that you have buffer time to, if you're running late, you're not going to be stressed and you're not going to be thinking, okay, what do I cut? What do I do in the heat of the moment? And secondly, then you'll have just like additional time for Q&A, because chances are you'll probably go like 75 minutes and then just have some extra time. And who knows, maybe even wrap a bit early, which people always appreciate. Efficiency is a good thing. So anyway, just always budget for less time. And if you're doing an hour workshop, you almost want to plan for like 45 to 50 minutes and have that 10-minute buffer. Again, just as you're getting accustomed to this, as you get more experience, you'll be able to get a lot tighter on your timing. But, as part of this whole make it easy for yourself, aim for less so that you have buffer time and you can eliminate stress from your life. It's a big game changer. So again, if you're following through this and you want to be building your, outlining your workshop as we go through, I invite you to hit pause for 1 minute and just really quickly write down your concept or framework, as well as the duration you're picking. So don't overthink it. Just go with your gut instinct. That's why it's 1 minute. It's meant to be really quick. And then you're ready to move on to the next section. All right, now you have your constraints. That section was ultra fast, so don't worry. The other sections are going to be a bit more in depth. So the point is just getting started. You just want to know, what is your time? What is the concept or framework you want to cover? And one of the things you'll see as you go through the following steps in the process is, even if you have a framework in mind, so for example, SMART goals, you might think, okay, I'm going to teach SMART goals, people how to set SMART goals in 60 to 90 minutes, only to realize later on that, okay, depending on how deep you want to go on the framework, you might have to do 5 workshops where you cover each step in its own unique workshop. So it'll really depend, but just a general kind of rule of thumb is people overestimate how much you can cover in 60 to 90 minutes. So I guarantee whatever you're planning to do is too much, and you're going to end up having to scrape some stuff back and potentially put it on the back burner as a separate workshop you can run in the future. So just keep that in mind. But as a starting point, you always want to have at least a time constraint and a topic in mind in terms of a framework or concept. And next we'll get into, okay, how do you then identify desired outcomes once you have that concept or framework top of mind? So we're going to dive into that now. All right, so next step is we're going to identify desired outcomes. So this is where we think about what are we shooting for and how do we work backwards to make sure we're being intentional about our time with our students or participants. So quite simply, you want to think about this in two ways. You want to think about it in terms of what is the artifact that people are going to create during their time together. So basically something they're going to produce. And you want to think of it like a noun, like something they're going to walk away with. And you want to think of that in the context of what's the next step they're going to take, using that artifact. So to make this more concrete, think of your artifact as social proof that your students can actually apply your concept or framework. So it's a support mechanism they're going to use in the future. And examples might include, for someone like me, if I'm running a session on how to outline a workshop, I want them to actually leave with a workshop outline. I mentioned earlier, another example could be a copywriter running a workshop on, how to use the AIDA framework. Well, walking away with like a draft cold email would be an artifact of, okay, yeah, they've actually applied this. And it's not saying it's going to be amazing. It's often like a first try or, a quick revision of a first try. So it's not like they're going to walk away with something out of this world. But the point is they're going to walk away with something that they can continue to build on. Because again, I keep saying like workshops are a primer to get better at stuff. And again, maybe someone who's teaching a workshop on pitching, I said I worked for a startup hub and we used to do sessions on how to make a good pitch. So they would leave the session with a draft pitch deck that they can then continue refining and getting feedback on. So it's kind of, what are they leaving with? And, for fun, I took this term from my friend Cam Hauser. What is the artifact they're leaving with? So think of it that way to kind of make it concrete, so to speak. And then you want to think of it importantly in terms of, what's the next step they're going to take with that artifact. So this is where you kind of want to contextualize, like, how is it going to serve students? So I talked about it being a primer. So I've used this phrase of students will leave with, this artifact so they can, and then it's accomplished this goal. And some examples from that based on the previous column are, students will leave with a first draft of their workshop outline so that they can run a workshop of their own. Another one could be, students will leave with a draft of a cold email to a prospective client so they can increase response rates on cold emails. And it's just this idea of, okay, you want them to leave with something, but don't get carried away of just thinking of something really cool or something, outrageously fun. Even if you want your workshop to be fun, but you also want it to be valuable in the sense of, don't just think, okay, what could they leave with, and think of like the latest, trend or something. Think of, okay, but what's actually going to serve them in the context of what they're trying to do in the grand scheme of things. So it's this, artifact, and like, what's the next step they're taking with it. So again, if you're following along and kind of completing these steps as we go, I would invite you to hit pause, take 2 minutes on your timer and write down what's the artifact and the next step you're shooting for. And again, 2 minutes, it's pretty quick, but just go with your gut instinct. If you have a few options, put them down, and then take another minute, reflect, and see which one makes the most sense. Sometimes listing out different options helps you kind of think through them. And just kind of use this sentence that I mentioned in the examples here of, if you were to plug them one in front of the other, do they make sense based on what you're trying to help students achieve in the grand scheme of things? All right, so once your time's up, then we're ready to head to the next section. All right, well done on identifying your desired outcome. So now that you know what you're striving for with your workshop, and I mean that in terms of what are people leaving with and what next step is that going to enable them to take? Because when you think about your workshops, you really want to think of them as primers for people to go deeper into your topic, whether it's a concept or framework. So you're really teeing them up to do something bigger. So that's why you really want to think of it as not just what are they leaving with, but think about it even further of like, why are they leaving with that thing? Like, what are they going to be able to do or continue doing that will serve them long term as they continue practicing to develop this skill? So now that you've nailed that, we're going to talk about how do you now create a path to those outcomes? What does that look like in order to help them get to those outcomes, to create that artifact and be able to take that next step? So let's get straight into it. Okay, so now that we know what our desired outcomes are, it's time to identify a path to those outcomes. So here's what I mean by that. There's two approaches to workshop design, and to be fair, there are other approaches. These aren't the only two, but in terms of, again, this kind of minimalist approach of keeping things simple and making it, a light lift, I think of it as doing it in one of two ways. So first of all, there's the all-in-one approach, as I call it, and this is where your students practice your concept or framework all at once. So some examples of that might be, making a 30-second pitch, drafting a cold email, you name it. And what I mean by that is if you're making a 30-second pitch and you're doing a workshop, you're not going to have students kind of, work out their first line of like, hey, I'm Alexandra Allen and I'm an online course designer, and then pause and then have everyone go around and then say, oh, I have 3 years of experience working for this company, 2 years working for that, et cetera, et cetera. It would become a fragmented pitch where you'd say like, wait, what? Like, I haven't heard their pitch in one go, so I can't evaluate it properly. So in the sense of, from my perspective anyway, and some people might disagree with this and rather do it that way. But for me, if someone's doing a pitch, I want it kind of them to structure it as like one cohesive whole versus doing it, in a fragment of, if it was something longer, then I would say, okay, do it in steps. But same with drafting a cold email. Some people might actually like to do it separately and say, okay, we're going to start by doing like our like email subject line. And then, the next step would be something else. But others might just be like, okay, here, I've been to one, I think it was by Sean Puri, and he did a great workshop on that. And it was like, okay, no, just, you have, 2 minutes or something, write your best cold email. And it was do it all in one go. And then you get feedback and iterate. So, the all-in-one approach is, do it all in one go as they're practicing it. And the other option is the step-by-step approach. So this is where students practice your concept or framework in what we call chunks in instructional design. Doesn't sound like a very nice word, but it essentially just means grouping information together to make it more memorable. And I always tell people, if you want to think of a great example of chunking, think of how phone numbers are formatted in North America, at least, with the 334, how numbers are grouped together. I know now no one remembers anyone's phone numbers because we all rely on our phones. But in the past, it was a lot easier to remember numbers in that format, visually and mentally. So that's a prime example of chunking information, just grouping it so that it's, you're remembering like 3 sections versus 10 different digits. So just something to keep in mind. And examples of step-by-step approaches would be something like maybe setting SMART goals. Let's say a project manager wants to walk them through the different elements one by one versus having people do them all in one go. They might want to go step by step. Someone like me, for example, how I'm walking you through this workshop, this is a prime example of going step by step. If I had given you all the steps to create your workshop on your own and just said like I want you to draft your entire workshop with your prompts and everything, you would have looked at me like I was crazy, or assuming we're in the session together, and just been like, whoa, this is so overwhelming compared to, remember at the start of the session, I said the first exercise was really easy because I was making the barrier of entry really low, so that you could get going, build some confidence and say like, yeah, like this is not so bad. I'm going step by step. It's okay. So if your topic is intimidating, just think, how would you want to learn it if you were in your students' or participants' shoes? Does it make more sense to go step by step, or is it something they can do like in one heavy lift? So again, a lot of this is intuitive, and a lot of, setting up your workshop will be intuitive decisions. So again, just kind of keeping it simple though, you want to think, what am I leaning towards, the all-in-one approach or the step-by-step? And just to kind of walk you through how you can structure these, the all-in-one approach is an example was, I mentioned I did that cold, it wasn't cold emailing, I guess it was, cold emailing workshop with Sean Puri. So that was a prime example of where he assigned a time-constrained task without instruction. So he just said, okay, I'm going to give you couple minutes, draft a cold email to a potential client that you're trying to pitch. And it was like, okay, whoa, like the time pressure is on, and everyone was like hustling to write something down and do their best. And he didn't give us any instructions other than just like do it. So it was like, okay, well, just go with your instincts. Then what happened is he then presented his framework after the fact. And the value of that is that, we saw what was wrong with our own stuff by evaluating it against his framework. And it made us realize, oh yeah, I totally made that mistake, and I made that mistake, and I need to fix this. So it kind of gives you this new perception of, oh, okay, actually, I've been making a lot of these mistakes, and this framework is actually really valuable. And then afterwards, he had us redo the task. So again, what helps with that in terms of the learning is we're practicing, we're reflecting. And I love this John Dewey quote of, we do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. So I think that's a great example of how if I do something, then I'm given a framework of how to evaluate myself. I reflect on what I could do differently and redo it. That's already me being really primed to get better at, drafting and editing my own cold emails. So it's really priming me to do better once I leave the workshop and continue practicing the skill on my own. And by seeing, mistakes that I've made, I'm more likely to remember them and avoid them in the future. So it's a really powerful format to, to structure your workshops in that way. Now, the other approach, which can be equally effective, is the step-by-step approach. And in this case, you're dividing your concept or framework into chunks. And again, I kind of explained the term of just essentially grouping information together. And 3 to 5 is really the sweet spot here. You can see in my agenda, I capped it at 5 items. And even that is kind of a lot. Ideally, I like to go with 3, just because in terms of our, our short-term memory, I mean, Miller's law says we can keep, 6 pieces of information plus or minus 2, depending on, the circumstance in our mind. But realistically, from what I've seen over the last few years of doing this, and even myself, what I notice is once you hit like 6, I find it a lot. And I find you even notice this, whether it's a LinkedIn post or specifically like a tweet or something. Once someone hits 6 lines, it's like that much heavier to process versus even just 5 lines. So 3 is ideal. 4 or 5, up to 4 or 5 is fine though. But again, this is where you're chunking information, grouping it into 3 or 5 components. And then once you do that, you're going to determine a sequence of activities to practice in each chunk. So unlike the all-in-one approach where you're doing like a single activity to practice everything at once, you might have different activities for each chunk. So you can get creative with how that works. They can all be, very similar. It's up to you. Like in my case, we're going pretty similar in terms of how I've structured the exercises of think of this, think of that. But the point is you're doing it for each individual chunk. And then finally, you want to determine, reflection prompts that make the learning stick. So again, if you think back to the all-in-one approach, I mentioned how we were presented with the framework, then we had to evaluate our own work. So it had that reflection component. So again, even when you're doing the step-by-step approach, you want to make sure that you have reflection prompts to see like, okay, does this work? Should I change this? And this is where you can incorporate things like breakout rooms so people get feedback that prompts you to think of, okay, what do I think of what they said? Do I agree with that? Do I disagree? If not, why? And, make changes on your work. So you can, it's kind of a different approach to getting the feedback, or it can be. But the point is you just want to have those prompts, whether they're discussions, that will really get the wheels turning of, okay, how do I self-evaluate and make whatever I'm doing better? So now what I want you to do is take this information that we've gone through and think about, first of all, what activity could you have your students or participants focus on to actually create the artifact? So this is where you want to just ask yourself, like, what do you want people to practice doing? So again, some examples include, from my own example is I want people to practice completing a workshop outline so that they'll start building that muscle and again, be primed to continue doing that and get better at doing it in the future. For the person who is doing the cold emailing workshop, they want the activity to be drafting a cold email to a prospective client. And then for someone who is doing the pitching one, maybe it's a 30-second elevator pitch to present and presenting it verbally. So it could be whatever you want, the activity, but the point is you want to just be clear on like, what are people practicing doing? And then based on what they're going to be doing, you want to think about, okay, what structure makes sense? Is it the all-in-one approach that you would use, for writing a cold email, making a pitch, or with going step by step the way I'm going for, creating an outline versus something like setting SMART goals, or, if I was teaching someone the 5 modes of design thinking, I'd probably want to go one by one. So think about the activity and then what makes sense. And again, don't overthink it. Go with your intuition. So again, this is where I say, if you're following along and doing the exercises, put 2 minutes on your timer, and then, just go with your gut instinct. You can always change it later. But then afterwards, once you're up with the 2 minutes, what I would normally do in if we were all together in a workshop is have you go into breakout rooms. So this is just a slide from a previous workshop I've run on this, where I would have people go into breakouts in groups of 3 for 12 minutes. So everyone has roughly, 3 minutes to share, plus a few extra buffer minutes for people to introduce themselves and kind of chat about additional questions. But I would have them share. Up until now, we've listed our, assuming you're doing the exercises, we've listed our constraints, our desired outcomes, and the path to the outcomes. So those 3 sections of their outline so far. So I would have them ask their group mates for feedback and ask them, do they see alignment? Do they have suggestions for improvement? And then they would take turns giving each other, kind of vetting them. And again, you don't have to agree with feedback you get from peers. but it at least makes you think twice about, okay, does this make sense, what I'm leaning towards? Do I need to think more about this? Because again, first draft, often you'll change a lot of stuff, but it's all about just getting things going. So if you are following along, what I'd encourage you to do is get your ideas down and then seek out a friend, mentor, colleague, or anyone, a potential student would be great, or participant, and vet it with them on like what you're thinking about in terms of how it would be structured. Get their feedback. Do they see the alignment? Is it making sense? You don't have to time them 12 minutes. You can just send it to them. And this is where I often use Google Docs, because you can just share it with someone and they can give you their feedback on what they think. But the point is, get feedback early on those kind of key things before we jump to the next section on kind of actually building out prompts for your activities and reflection. All right, so now that you've identified what activity you're going to cover in your workshop, and ideally whether or not you're going to do it step by step or all in one go, now you really want to start thinking about, okay, how do you flesh that out in terms of turning them into concrete prompts for activities, for reflection, you name it. So now we're going to jump into, what does that look like? What does breaking it down and getting specific on the language around how to tee people up for these exercises actually look like? So let's dive right in. Congrats, we made it to the 5th and final agenda item, draft activity and reflection prompts. So here's where I would normally invite people to do a 10-minute silent writing exercise. And this is where we create, again, what I call this child's draft of your outline. So it's just this idea of, remember, it's okay if it's messy, go with your first instincts. You can always, refine it later based on feedback. But the idea is just start by getting some ideas down, because you don't want to overthink it. So you want to create this pressure by just time boxing it 10 minutes, get some ideas down, and then go from there. So normally what I do here now is I have people open a template that I use in my course on how to create courses and workshops. And I have them make a copy of this document. And then you see, if you scroll down, I have people pick between whether or not they're using template A or B. So before I get into that, I'll just talk about how, these first 3 steps you'll recognize. These are the ones we went through. We created our constraints, we identified desired outcomes, and then we identified a path to the outcomes. So again, these are just steps that we went through initially as part of our high-level overview in the first phase of creating our workshop. And now what we're doing is part 2. So this is where I tell people, pick between option A, the all-in-one, or template B, the step-by-step. So let's say we were doing the all-in-one approach. I have a template here, so I call this kind of my run sheet, where I'll go through the steps of how to complete it, but ultimately I put in the title and the duration. So those were we didn't decide on the title, we decided on the concept, but I usually fine tune the title and description at the end. I kind of put in like standard ones, fill-in ones like at the start, and then I update them based on how I flesh it out and if I have more specific language to articulate it. So then my core focus with developing the workshop initially is filling out this part right here, which is, okay, you see these parts are in yellow. So starting with the prompts of what is the prompt for the first activity? If they're going to redo the activity, exactly what's the prompt? So like what specific language, like how am I instructing them to do that? So similar to how I showed you with like my breakout rooms of how I described what you were going to share, how you were going to share it, and the order. You just want to flesh out those prompts. I write them out here before I turn them into slides, so that way I don't get confused with the flow and how the event works. And some people prefer to do this too on Miro or Mural, or even like Post-its or a piece of paper where you jot them out. And some people like to go like side to side, like an experience. I like to go in a list of thinking of what the rundown is, like by timing. But again, do whatever feels comfortable to you in terms of just kind of figuring out what are the activities, what's like a discussion prompt you could have if you want to do at least one breakout, which I highly recommend if you're doing a workshop, because that's the whole point. People come is to connect with other people, to get feedback. So what would the prompt be for your breakout room? Again, I showed you mine earlier. So again, just kind of think through these things in yellow, and then afterwards, that's when you want to think about these other optional things of maybe you'll put, 2 or 3 people in the hot seat when you share, after you share your framework, to show how you would make theirs better using your framework. You always want to debunk the myths and set expectations like I did. So again, this is why I've gone through it in this format of showing you my slides, so you can, again, use the timestamps in the description to hop back and think about how you might want to do the same with yours. Have your intro and agenda. And again, just think about all these things. And then in terms of the content and, how you're going to present that throughout the session, make sure that it's built around these prompts. So again, you're remaining focused on what people are doing and only providing just enough information for them to do it successfully. So this is how it works for the the all-in-one approach. And again, in terms of the order of completing it, you could do this any way you like, but if you want to kind of take my formula, I normally say, I add the workshop title and duration to start with, I add a description, and then I complete the run sheet. I kind of circle back to these at the end, and like I said, kind of fine tune them to make them a bit better. But I start by drafting the activity prompts. And again, I said I highlighted them in yellow. And then the reflection prompts, because the reflections are informed by what the activity is. And then afterwards, describe the content you're going to share so you can start thinking about that. Because again, the big mistake people make here is they think, oh, like I know a lot about this one thing, so I'm just going to create what they call a workshop. And then it ends up being them running through a ton of content. So that's more of a webinar. Even if you do have kind of polls and stuff, it's not fully a workshop in my, from my perspective anyway. So again, think about what's the content you can use to supplement those activities. And then finally, just go over it. And like I said, this is your child's draft. And then the last step is modifying it as you see fit. So play around with it, figure out your own flow, and don't feel confined by my way of doing it. This is just a way to get you, moving, give you something to react to so you can think of what works best for you. So that's the all-in-one approach. And the step-by-step approach is pretty similar. It has a few more steps in the sense of there's a bit more movement of, you can see specifically down here where I say like write your prompt for activity 1, write your prompt for activity 2, and then breakout room 1, 2, recap discussions. The thing is, I've written them out here, and who knows, maybe you'll have 3 activities, maybe you'll just have 1, maybe you'll have 1 breakout or 2. So I'm just going to put these in as general of you could have 1 or 2, you could have more or less, but ideally, the reason I've listed them here is you're going to move these around. So let's say your first activity is, exercise, whatever. After that, you want to have maybe a breakout session or maybe a recap discussion. So you can pull up, this line or that one and put it under activity 1. And then maybe activity 2 kicks off another breakout and another recap discussion. So you can move these around. I've just grouped them here to kind of give you an idea if you want to think about activities, breakouts, and recap discussions, move them around. But otherwise, you can see this top part is pretty much similar to the previous one where you still want to do your intro and agenda, debunk myths and expectations, doing an icebreaker at the start. Sometimes it could be like paste something in the chat or, have people raise their hand to share something. And again, you want to do your closing and send off and have some sort of call to action. So those things are the same. It's just kind of the middle that moves around depending on what you want to do. So I have a lot of examples of these that I share in my course, if ever, and I'll be sharing more videos on these so you can follow along. But these are just some additional tips that you can use to make your outline strong. So like I said, play around with the elements as you fine tune it, modify them as you see fit. And I always say, always be prepared to cut something. So like I said, most people, when you're new to this, you have a tendency to go over by at least 10 minutes. So try and plan as if you're doing something for 45 minutes or so, or 50 max. And that way you'll have a buffer and you won't be panicking of like, okay, how do I cut something without seeming rushed? And again, just remember, prioritize students taking action and use your slides as content to drive them to action. And then in terms of your next steps, like I said, get feedback from 2 or 3 people on your outline and, make improvements or at least think through them. I always say make your slides after you're finished because otherwise you get lost in the slides and then you don't really spot the logic gaps as well. So make it tight, start, I call it like start flat and then add dimension by adding your slides. In terms of, practice running through your workshops, I recommend using Loom or Zoom to record yourself because what happens is it really puts you in the driver's seat of imagining you're presenting because I've had many people, whether it's in my course community or, people I've worked with one-to-one where they think they have everything perfectly ready to go. And then the minute they're ready, they set up and, I join them for their first session before everyone joins. They're like, oh my God, I can't see my presenter notes. Or if I'm sharing this screen, I didn't realize people would also see my notes, or I can't see everyone's faces when I'm looking at the slides. And just these little glitchy things, they're much easier to iron out if you do them before your session. You'll feel much calmer, much more relaxed. And then that way you'll actually be having fun and your students will mirror that energy back to you. So again, you can ignore this last line. This is just because, again, I'm showing you a template from my 8 course on how to create courses, and a lot of it goes into workshops. Otherwise it's just kind of think of it like that. But heading back, I also, if you are interested in, going deeper on this, I have sample outlines that I link if ever you wanted to look into joining my course or becoming a member. It's a one-time fee, and then it's an evergreen course that you can go through, and there's live office hours. live office hours with me and other members of the community each week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We have a 24/7 Discord community where you can ask questions, get feedback on your workshops or on your courses. So just something to keep in mind if you want to go deeper on this stuff. But otherwise, in the meantime, you can subscribe to my channel and sign up to my newsletter, which is linked to my profile as well. So that's really kind of the last step. And again, this is just another sample of what I would do in a breakout room. Like I said in the previous sheet, show it to, a couple people, get their feedback. This is another prompt I would use if we were all together in a Zoom room to have you get some live feedback from people who have also just run through the same process on how you can improve it, how you can make it better. So you could use these questions to ask other people in asking for their feedback as well. So again, just agenda recap. Congrats on making it this far. We debunked myths, we created constraints, we identified desired outcomes and a path to those outcomes. And then finally, we drafted activity and reflection prompts. Okay, so your next step is to keep refining your outline, get some feedback, keep working on it. Then you want to make your slides and finally practice on Zoom and Loom, whichever of the two you prefer, and get comfortable, observe yourself, see what you could do better, just so that you feel that much more confident for the big day when you run the workshop. And I'm telling you, the more you practice this, the more confident you'll become, the more fun you'll have, and the more you'll raise your profile as an expert in your field. So have fun with it. If you want more content like this, definitely subscribe to my channel. I'll be sharing a lot more here going forward. You can subscribe to my newsletter, my links in my bio. And also, if you're ready to really kick things up, get serious about creating workshops and online courses, then join my course creator community. It's an evergreen course, like I said. So the content is always there. You can work through it in your own time. But I also run monthly sprints and can help you set your own deadlines so that you're staying accountable, and you can join my live office hours from week to week. So on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I'll make sure that you are moving forward and really just kind of, trying things, iterating, and just having fun in the meantime. So thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.